Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into a topic that's, well, it's pretty loaded, We're looking at faith and politics, specifically how Donald Trump's, his public image and how it kind of intersects with the teachings of Christ.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure.
It is. And look, we're not here to judge or, endorse anyone. It's more about, prompting some reflection. How do people, especially those in the public eye, how do they, live out their faith? What does that even look like?
Right, right. It's a question that's been around forever, right? I mean, how do you balance personal beliefs
Right.
with the demands of power? And when you've got someone like Trump well, he's very openly identified with Christianity, kind of forces you to ask, like, are his actions actually lining up with what he says he believes?
Exactly. And that's where our sources come in. They lay out, the core stuff of Christ's teachings: love, compassion, humility, service, that whole idea of mercy over judgment,
Mm.
taking care of those who are struggling, and rejecting the whole materialism thing.
Yeah, and those teachings, especially how they're shown in the Gospels, I mean, they often go against like the norms of society and power structures.
Totally. So then how does all that line up with how Trump talks and acts, especially when he's, being confrontational or divisive?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The sources bring up a bunch of times where Trump uses, insults and mockery and just divisive language.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about his rallies, his statements, even his social media.
Right. And he's always giving people like these nasty nicknames, or he just dismisses anyone who disagrees with him as, enemies of the state. And that kind of talk just doesn't seem to fit with what Christ taught about, like, loving your enemies, praying for those who, persecute you, and actually trying to find reconciliation.
Even his refusal to concede the election back in 2020, and then all the claims of, a stolen election, that seems to clash with that whole Christian message of, peacemaking, forgiveness, trying to find unity.
Yeah, it does create some tension there. I mean, Christ really emphasized truth, justice, integrity. And it's normal to question things, right? Especially election results, if it's
Yeah.
close.
Sure.
But the way those claims were made, and then what happened after, like, January 6th, it makes you wonder if it was really in the spirit of peace and reconciliation that, Christ was all about.
And then there's the whole issue of wealth and materialism. The sources point out this huge contrast between how Christ warned about the dangers of, being rich, and then Trump's whole image as this billionaire who's all about financial success.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Christianity has it's a complicated history with wealth. I mean, some parts of the Bible really condemn chasing riches and say it's super important to help the poor, but then other parts suggest that wealth can be like a blessing from God.
So it's not really about being rich or poor.
Yeah, a lot of theologians say it's about what's in your heart. Like, are you using your money to be selfish or to help others? Do you see it as the end goal, or like a tool to do something bigger?
So it's more about your actions and what you value, not just the money itself.
Exactly. And that's why looking at Trump's policies, like the 2017 tax cuts, the ones that really helped the wealthy, it makes you think, does that line up with, taking care of the poor, the marginalized? Does it show he cares about like economic justice and using wealth for good?
It seems like actions speak louder than words, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And when it comes to actions, the sources also bring up Trump's policies and what he's said about marginalized groups.
Yeah.
Like, remember the family separation policy back in 2018 at the border?
Yeah.
I mean, separating families, especially like that, it just seems so against everything Christ taught about, compassion and mercy and welcoming people who are different.
It's hard to imagine Christ being okay with something that causes so much pain, And the sources also talk about how Trump tried to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and how he talked about immigrants and his views on racial justice. All those things seem pretty different from, taking care of the sick, welcoming strangers, and loving your neighbor.
Right. And we should say that Christians have a lot of different perspectives on these things.
Of course.
But if you look at the core of what Christ taught, what's in the Gospels, it always comes back to love, compassion, and taking care of those who are struggling.
Okay, so we've got this tension between Christ's message of humility and service, and then how Trump leads, which is often about, self-promotion and saying how great he is, like that whole I alone can fix it thing.
Yeah.
How does that line up with how Christ led, as a servant?
They're pretty different, aren't they? I mean, Christ washed his disciples' feet, right? That's humility, that's service. He said that real greatness is about putting others first. And Trump's way of doing things, it seems to be more about, himself and what he can gain, makes you think, what does it really mean to lead with integrity? Should power be about making yourself look good or about helping others?
It's like they're on opposite ends of the leadership spectrum, you know? One's all about selflessness and the other's all about self-interest. And that changes how you see power, responsibility, and what leadership is even for.
Exactly. And that leads to another big point the sources make, hypocrisy. Christ really went after hypocrites,
Right.
especially religious leaders.
Right. He didn't like people who, acted all holy but weren't really compassionate or just.
Yeah. And the sources bring up some of the criticisms against Trump, like accusations of dishonesty, all those documented false or misleading claims, and the allegations of sexual misconduct. And if those are true, they don't really fit with what Christ taught about being honest, having integrity, and treating people with respect. So it makes you ask, can you really say you're defending Christianity while doing things that a lot of people would see as, well, unchristian?
It's a complicated issue, for sure, but it shows how important it is to, make your actions match your beliefs. Faith isn't just about, words or symbols. It's about actually living out the values you say you believe in. And it's about holding ourselves accountable, and our leaders, too, to a higher standard, ethically. So we've talked about a bunch of areas where Trump's actions and words seem to go against what Christ taught. But it's important to say that there are other arguments out there, other perspectives that we need to look at, too.
Right, exactly. And the sources do a good job of showing those opposing viewpoints. They acknowledge that a lot of people think Trump's policies and actions do line up with Christian values.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at those arguments and see, how they hold up.
I'm all for that. Let's dive into those counterarguments and see if they can bridge the gap between Trump's image and the teachings of Christ.
So one of the big arguments people make about Trump being aligned with Christianity has to do with his judicial appointments, especially the ones that, favored those conservative Christian causes.
Yeah, those Supreme Court picks, the ones that ended up overturning Roe v. Wade, a lot of people who are, anti-abortion were really happy about that. So how does that fit into this whole discussion about Trump and Christianity?
Well, it's definitely a big deal for a lot of Christians. Being against abortion comes from this deep belief in, the sanctity of life. And that idea is rooted in how they understand the Bible. So appointing judges who agree with that view, it aligns with their values. And it's like, for them, it's putting faith into action.
But the sources also point out that, focusing only on one issue, like just abortion, it can kind of make people miss that bigger message of justice and compassion that's all over the Gospels. Christ's teachings, they cover a lot of stuff, from poverty and hunger to taking care of the sick and welcoming people who are different.
Yeah, that's super important to remember. When you boil down faith to just one political issue, you risk kind of ignoring all the other stuff that Christian ethics is about. It makes you think. Can you really say you're following what Christ taught if you're ignoring all those other areas where he said we should act justly and be merciful?
So it's about looking at faith as a whole, not just focusing on one specific political fight.
Exactly. It's about considering all of Christ's teachings and trying to live them out in, everything you do.
Another thing the sources bring up is Trump's support for those religious liberty policies. But they point out that, the way he supports it, it often seems like it's more about, the rights of certain Christian groups and not so much about others, especially the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, and that brings up some really tough questions about what religious freedom really means and how it should work in a society where people believe different things. I mean, protecting people's right to practice their faith is super important. But it becomes a problem when those rights are used to, discriminate against others or actually hurt them.
So it's this balancing act, right? Protecting religious freedom, but also making sure everyone is treated with respect and dignity, no matter what they believe or their sexual orientation.
Right. It's about realizing that real religious freedom means respecting everyone's rights and beliefs, not just the people who agree with a certain political or religious view.
And the sources also touch on this thing called the prosperity gospel, which is linking faith with wealth and success. They say that how Trump talks about winning and money and personal achievement, it kind of clicks with some American Christians who believe in this prosperity gospel thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is where you see some real tension within Christianity.
Yeah.
The prosperity gospel has gotten pretty popular, especially in the U.S. It's all about how God wants his followers to be rich and that being wealthy is like a sign that God is happy with you. but that goes against what Christ taught about the dangers of being rich and how he, identified with the poor and those who were struggling, and how he said we should focus on treasures in heaven, not on earth.
Yeah. So it's two totally different ways of looking at how faith and money connect. One sees being rich as a good thing, a blessing. The other sees it as something that could, get in the way of your spiritual growth.
Exactly. And it makes you ask, how do we define success? What does it really mean to live a life of faith? Is it about stuff and worldly achievements, or is it about something deeper, something more spiritual, something more like, what Christ taught about humility and service?
It makes you think about your own values, doesn't it? What do you prioritize in life?
Yeah, for sure. And it also affects how we see things like economic inequality, social justice, and our responsibility to take care of people who are struggling.
Okay, so we've looked at the arguments about judges, religious freedom, and this prosperity gospel idea. Are there any other big counter arguments that the sources bring up?
There's one more that's worth talking about. Some people argue that Trump's policies, even though they were, kind of different or even harsh sometimes, they were actually in line with Christian values because they focused on strength, security, and protecting America's interests.
So they're saying his focus on being strong and safe, that's somehow connected to how they see Christian values, like the values of order, authority, and protecting tradition.
Yeah, that's the idea. They say that what he did, even if it wasn't always, perfectly aligned with Christian ethics, came from wanting to promote what they see as a strong moral framework and to protect the nation from threats, both inside and outside the country.
But that raises a question, doesn't it? Is being strong and secure, like in a purely nationalistic way, is that really what Christ was teaching? His message often went beyond national borders and was about loving everyone, even your enemies.
That's a really important point. What Christ taught often challenges how we usually think about power and security. He said to love your enemies, to turn the other cheek, and to try to make peace, not fight. It doesn't mean you can't defend yourself or your country, but it does suggest a different way of approaching things, a way that's based on compassion, forgiveness, and seeing the humanity in everyone, even the people we might think of as enemies.
So it's finding that balance again, right? Protecting your nation, but also holding on to those values of compassion, forgiveness, and recognizing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter where they're from or what they believe.
Exactly. It's about understanding that real strength isn't about military power or political dominance. It's about living out those values of love, justice, and mercy that Christ showed us.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the main counter arguments about Trump being aligned with Christianity. What's the big takeaway here? Do those arguments really bridge the gap between, his personality and what Christ taught?
It's a complicated question. There's no easy answer. The sources seem to be saying that while some Christians might agree with those counter-arguments, they don't really address the main tension between Trump's worldview and the core principles of Christian ethics, especially the ones about humility, compassion, service, and putting the needs of the marginalized first.
So even though there might be some things they agree on, overall it seems like there's a pretty big disconnect between what he does and what Christ taught.
That's what the sources seem to be saying, yeah. They recognize that there are different perspectives within Christianity, and people don't always interpret or apply the teachings the same way. But in the end, they argue that what Trump does and says often goes against the broader teachings of Christ, especially when it comes to humility, compassion, and prioritizing those who are struggling.
Okay, that makes sense. But the sources don't stop there, do they? They go deeper, looking at specific themes and Bible passages that really highlight that difference between, Trump and Christ's teachings.
Right. They do some interesting comparisons that really show the contrast between those two worldviews. For example, they put Christ's teaching, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last," next to Trump's slogan, "America first."
That's a pretty interesting comparison. What do you think they're trying to say by doing that?
I think they're highlighting that big difference between Christ's message of, humility and service, which often flips the script on how the world sees things, and Trump's focus on putting America first and being competitive. Christ's teachings are about putting the needs of the most vulnerable first, no matter where they're from or their social status. But Trump's slogan, it's about one nation's interests above others, which could lead to a more self-centered and less compassionate approach to things happening globally.
Yeah, it's powerful. It really shows you the core of how their worldviews are different. One's about selflessness and caring for everyone, and the other's about power, being in charge, and putting yourself first.
Exactly. And that difference has a huge impact on how we see things like global cooperation, foreign aid, immigration, and how we take care of those who are less fortunate, both here and in other countries.
It's like choosing between a view that values love, compassion, and caring for everyone, or one that's about self-interest, competition, and getting power.
And that choice has consequences, not just for us as individuals, but for whole societies and nations.
Another interesting comparison they make is between what Christ taught about wealth and that whole love of money idea, and then Trump's persona, which is all about, being rich equals success.
Right. They bring up verses like, no one can serve both God and money, and the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And those teachings, they directly challenge this idea that getting rich means God is on your side, or that it's what really makes you successful.
And they contrast those verses with, how Trump is always showing off his wealth, his fancy lifestyle, and his policies that often seem to, make economic inequality worse.
It's a stark reminder that what Christ valued is often the opposite of the materialistic stuff that our culture is obsessed with.
The sources also talk about how Trump uses Christian symbols and rhetoric to get political support, like that photo op at Lafayette Square back in 2020,
Yeah.
and how he's always trying to appeal to Christian voters.
Yeah, that makes you wonder, is he really motivated by faith?
Yeah.
Or is he just using it to get power?
It's about figuring out if it's real faith that guides his actions or if he's just, using religion to get what he wants.
Exactly. And that's where hypocrisy comes in again. Christ didn't like people who used religion to hide their real intentions, people
Yeah.
who acted all religious but didn't really care about love and compassion.
So it's not enough to just talk about faith or use religious words. It's about showing your beliefs through your actions, actions that reflect humility, service, and truly caring for others.
Exactly. Real faith should be seen in what you do, not just what you say.
Okay, so we've looked at all these comparisons that show the differences between Trump and what Christ taught. But the sources also address this question that comes up a lot. Is Trump against Christ or an antichrist?
Oh, that's a tough one. The sources are pretty careful with that question. They explain what the term antichrist really means, theologically speaking. It usually refers to people who deny what Christ taught or who are actively against his message.
So it's not just about disagreeing with someone's policies or not liking them. It's about, completely rejecting the core of what Christ was saying.
Right. And while the sources say that Trump's actions and words often clash with Christ's teachings, they don't think it's right to label him as the Antichrist. They say that kind of talk makes it seem more dramatic than it is and simplifies a complicated theological idea into this, good versus evil thing.
But they do say that Trump's worldview, especially how he focuses on power, wealth, and putting America first, makes him a counter-witness to Christ's message of humility, love, and service.
That's an important difference. It's not about making Trump sound evil or name-calling. It's about recognizing that his values and priorities are often the opposite of the basic principles of Christianity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here talking about this whole complicated relationship between Trump and the teachings of Christ. It's definitely something that people have strong opinions about. But before we finish up, is there anything else the sources point out that you think is really important or makes people think?
Well, one thing that really stuck out to me was how the sources talked about, the bigger picture of this whole conversation. They said that Trump getting into power and all the support he got from people who call themselves Christians, it shows kind of a crisis of faith happening in public life.
A crisis of faith. What do you mean by that?
The sources say that Christianity, how it's seen in public, it often gets reduced to just a label or a political tool instead of being, a guide for how to act ethically. It's like people are more worried about being seen as Christian or deciding with a certain political party than they are about actually living out what Christ taught in a real, consistent way.
So it's more about, identity politics than actually changing on a spiritual level.
Exactly. And that's what I found so interesting. It's a challenge for all of us, no matter what our politics are, to really look at how we're living out our faith.
Yeah.
Are we letting our beliefs actually change how we act? Or are we just using religion to back up our own biases or political agendas?
That's a tough question. It makes you really think about things.
It does. It requires us to be honest with ourselves, And it reminds me of what that theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, wrote about cheap grace.
Oh yeah, Bonhoeffer. He was a really interesting guy. What did he mean by cheap grace?
He was warning against a kind of faith that's all about forgiveness without actually needing to change your ways. A faith that makes you feel good but doesn't require you to actually change how you act or what you care about.
And that seems like a pretty relevant warning these days, when faith is often used to justify doing things that go against the very values it claims to be about.
Exactly. Bonhoeffer's challenge to us is to make sure our faith isn't just something we say we are, or a tool to get what we want politically, but something that actually changes how we act, the choices we make, and how we treat the world around us.
So it's about going beyond just, looking religious and actually embracing what the gospel asks of us, even when it's hard or people don't like it.
Right. It's about realizing that real faith isn't just about words or symbols. It's about actually living out those values of love, compassion, justice, and humility in everything we do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into, Trump and the teachings of Christ, what are some of the big takeaways you hope people listening will think about?
Well, first off, I hope this makes people think more deeply about what it means to really live out their faith, especially when everyone's watching. It's not about blindly following a political party or a leader. It's about making sure our actions match up with what Christ taught, even when it's hard or unpopular.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the political fighting, but real faith is about rising above that and striving for something better.
Yeah, and second, I hope this episode gets people talking about how we hold our leaders accountable to ethical standards, no matter their religion or politics. We have to be willing to call out hypocrisy, to speak up against injustice, and to demand integrity from those in power.
That's so true. It's easy to ignore bad behavior from people we like, but real accountability means sticking to our values no matter who's in charge.
And lastly, I hope this encourages listeners to talk respectfully with people who see things differently. It's easy to just stay in our own little bubbles and think everyone who disagrees with us is wrong. But if we want to really understand each other and make progress, we have to be willing to listen, to learn, and to find common ground.
Well said. It reminds us that having thoughtful, respectful conversations is super important for a healthy democracy and a strong faith community.
So to go back to our original question, can someone claim to be a Christian while constantly going against what Christianity teaches? Well, based on the sources and what we talked about today, it seems like that's a question each person has to answer for themselves.
It's a question that pushes us to go beyond just saying we have faith and to look at how our beliefs and our actions really line up. It's a call to be more than just, Sunday Christians and to actually show the love, justice, and mercy of Christ in everything we do.
I like that. It's a journey that lasts a lifetime, and one that needs us to constantly look inward and be open to being challenged and changed by what the gospel teaches.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored these, kind of complicated and challenging ideas.
It was great to be here. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep thinking, and keep trying to live out your values in a way that honors both your faith and who you are as a person.